Jerry, 1932, you were born in Harlem Hospital, and you grew up in the Bronx.
Yeah, I don't remember Harlem. I remember the Bronx, though.
Well, let's go back when you were a little boy. Tell me, what do you remember when you're just...
Well, street games, out on the street all the time until mothers yelled their lungs out trying to get you to get back in for dinner. So once school was over and whatever, we'd go out on the street and make up our games and play those games.
What did your dad do for a living?
He was a poultryman. He kept chickens. They were hard-working people. And he worked 6 days a week. And so he worked for other people during the week, and then on Saturdays he had a market in Harlem that he sold fresh chickens to, and actually killed them sometimes. If a person wanted a really fresh killed chicken. And sometimes I'd go down there. Now, in fact, this scar right here is a memento of one of those visits. I was cutting like a little wooden knife, you know, with a pocket knife,
right.
Making a knife, and the blade was dull, so I figured I could do it a lot faster if I took one of his cleavers, meat cleavers, on the wooden chopping block, and I went like this, and I missed, and so there's the memento, always embedded in my memory.
How old were you at the time?
Oh, 12, something like that.
Did you go back the next day?
No.
You had two older brothers, and you were all born around the Depression time. Did your folks ever talk to you about that, how it affected them, the Great Depression?
No, not really. My folks spoke to each other primarily in Yiddish. They came from Poland, and they knew some Russian and some Polish words, but they spoke mostly to each other in Yiddish. And if they spoke about the Depression, it was probably complaining and so on, and it was done in Yiddish.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand most of it. I myself don't remember the Depression. I'm sure my oldest brother did, who died a year ago, December. He was 90. By the time the Depression was over, what I do remember is primarily World War II. So by the time 1940s came around, I remember that.
Your parents, did they come over together, or did they meet here?
I never got that straight. They came from different villages in different shtetls, you know, in Poland. When they actually met, I really don't know.
Do you know when it was when they came over, what time frame, what year it was?
Oh, it was around it was just before World War I broke out. So it was around 1911, 12, something like that. And my father told the story. We didn't know about this until he was visiting us one day in Texas. And my wife asked him a question, and I never had asked him that question about him coming over. And he told the story. It was just amazing, but almost unbelievable. His older brother had already migrated to the United States and was working in a chicken farm or egg farm in New Jersey, and sent him money to come over. And he was 14 at the time, and they were gathering young people and older people, whatever, to be in the military, because the various factions, Austria-Hungarian Empire and so on, were building up their forces, getting ready for what everyone knew would be a war. And so even though he was 14, he was eligible, and he didn't want to go into the military. And so he had the money to leave for transport, and he just got on a train. But the border police and the army, the military, were going through and checking people's papers on the train. Until they got to Switzerland, they could be captured. So he tells a story that this woman, this heavy-set woman, back in those days, the dresses were billowed out.
Right.
And she had a bunch of children in one of the cars. they took up one of these drawing cars all by themselves, her and all these kids running around. And he kept going back and forth trying to evade the police that were on the train, or the army that was on the train checking papers. And when she saw him, she figured things out, and she was German, said, "Kommen Sie her, Kinder." And she pointed to her dress. She sat down at the table, much like the table here, sat down at the table, and he went under her skirt and hid while they came through.
Wow.
And so he said that she saved his life at 14 years of age, and then he caught the boat somewhere in France and came over.
What about your mom?
I don't know her story. I really don't.
Okay, so your grandparents, do you know anything about them?
No, I saw pictures. I think my oldest brother has photographs, and his son probably has them now. But with the beard, you know, the old European figures. And they came from a shtetl, and they were probably Orthodox Jews. And my parents were supposedly Orthodox, but they really weren't. You know, they were a little more modernized in the United States and Americanized.
Right.
And so they didn't follow all the rituals and so on. But we did go to an Orthodox synagogue.
Yeah. Did your dad ever tell you what it was like to be 14 and in the United States?
Well, he was very grateful being in the United States. I have two quick stories. Once he was visiting us, and we went to White Rock Lake, and with our twin girls, and there were ducks. And of course, he was a chicken guy, so he thought it was real neat. He almost tried to grab one. I said, "You're not supposed to grab those things. You know, you can get arrested." But he had an expression, "God bless America." When he saw something that touched his heart, he would say, "God bless America." When I was working in Yellowstone Park, and he saw the geyser and all these people watching and everything, he said, "God bless America." You know, that people could enjoy themselves, and this thing could be here for people to see. When we went to visit him in New York City, we took a trip a couple of times, and we took him to a Broadway show, and we thought he would enjoy Fiddler on the Roof with the Jerome. And he sat between my wife and myself, and I could see that he had a sad face. And he wanted to leave the show. It brought back bad memories.
Yeah.
He said, "I came to this country to forget that, to get away from that, because of the Cossacks, the pogroms, you know, the discrimination and all that, all the negative stuff, and trying to scrape a living and so on." And even though that the show was joyful and so on, and you know, world acclaim, to him it was a reminder of the shtetl.
Yeah.
So we had to leave early.
Now, was your mom there too?
No. She developed a mental illness, and they separated and eventually divorced. And so she had to go to a nursing home, like institutionalized, because she couldn't take care of herself well.
What time frame was that?
Well, it developed over a period of time, but so that had to be in the late 50s.
Okay. Okay, now when you're a kid up in the Bronx, all the sport teams, you know, are big in New York, of course. Did you have a team? Did you ever go to any of the games?
I was the fat kid on the block. You know, nowadays it's not unusual for people to be obese or fat, but back then it was. And I was one of the few. I was the fat kid on the block. I had gotten up to 270 pounds at one point when I was around 14. And so I didn't participate in sports. I wasn't selected. You know, we get together and draw teams, you know, and so on. And if they were desperate, I'd be the last person selected, and I'd be put out in the outfield, way out. But I would either keep score or I'd try to participate, and we had different games. And one of the games I was, because of my weight, I was wanted because it involved jumping on the backs of people and trying to break up the line. I was the heaviest kid on the block, and therefore they wanted me to be on their team for that.
Right. What about the pro teams?
Oh, I was a fan of the Yankees, of course, and I used to like to go to the games. I had a problem with school, or they had a problem with me, or whatever. But I wasn't very studious, and if there was a game and I had enough money or whatever, I'd go to a game, whether there was school or not. And so I did play the hook once in a while. What I enjoyed when I went to the game was just watching the game in general and eating hot dogs. And that with the sauerkraut, Nathan's hot dogs. My friends, they kept statistics, and I never kept statistics about players, how many hits and errors and so on and so forth. I remember I must have been about 7 years old. There was an elevated subway train we called back then, that's called maybe number 4 now, but it was called the Jerome Avenue subway. And the stop was 161st Street and River Avenue, which was the Yankee Stadium back then, not the new one, but the old one. And if you stood on the end of the platform while there was a game, and you could look over and you could see just a portion of the field from that stand. And there were people who watched the game from the elevated subway. And I remember one day, and it was also the station in which you got off from the local to get the express. And so it was a busy station, whether there was a game or not. But I remember I must have been with 1 or 2 of my brothers, because that early I wouldn't be traveling alone. But I must have been about 7 years old, and it got very quiet at that game, and you could hear the reverberating sound of someone speaking over the microphone. And it was the retirement of Lou Gehrig coming over that speaker when he spoke, and he was dying and whatever. And that was that. I didn't know till later what it was, but that's what it was. It was eerie because it wasn't the regular game sound.
When you were a young child, 10, 11 years old maybe, World War II broke out. How did that affect you?
My 2 older brothers, they went in. My oldest brother, Ruby, he went into the Army, and all his friends, just about everybody went in the Army or military. And if you were of age, a young man, and weren't in the military during World War II, there must have been something wrong with you. And it was embarrassing for those people to be ones that weren't in there. And but there were people who were 4F, who were physically unable to not accepted. So anyway, my oldest brother went in. He was in the Army, and I didn't find out till his funeral how extensive his service was. He earned ribbons from 3 different areas of the world, from African campaign to Europe, and then when he thought he was coming back to the States, his ship went through the Panama Canal, and he ended up in the Pacific in the Philippines.
Wow.
And he thought he was on his way home. So anyway, that was his situation. And then my other brother, who was amazing with electronics and science, and he's the one that became a scientist. And during World War II, or even at the very start of it, he was a senior in high school. And he used to walk around making his own radios. He'd buy radio parts and so on, and build his own kits and so on, put radios together. And one time he put together he saw an illustration in Popular Science magazine of a thing called a walkie-talkie. It was about this long with a big antenna on it. And so he built that himself. And they called him walkie-talkie because he'd walk around with a file. And those holes where you put the dials and the meters and so on had to be set at a certain gauge and so on, a certain size, and he'd walk around with that scraping file. You can hear him a block away coming. And they'd say, "Here comes walkie-talkie," because he was building that walkie-talkie. And in order to operate it, you had to have a federal license because it was the wartime. And you had to be registered and operate a shortwave radio, and that was considered shortwave. So in any case, he had a federal license. He was very smart. He practiced the Morse code. I remember at home, tick, 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 and all that. And then during the summer, when he was still in high school, he was a senior. And during the summer, before his last year of high school, he joined the Merchant Marine. He was 17 years old. He joined the Merchant Marine. He had a radio operator's license, and he went on as a radio operator on a merchant ship. And they sailed down the east coast of the United States, South America, across to the west coast of Africa, and came up into North Africa, and came back to New York. And that was his voyage for the summer.
Yeah.
And then he went back to school and finished up.
Now, did your parents ever talk to you about World War II?
Not really. I remember Pearl Harbor. I was at a birthday party for a friend, and they were talking about it came over the radio and so on, and so the party sort of ended on a dull note, that we're at war. And nobody knew, even the adults didn't even know Pearl Harbor was part of American territory.
Right.
Never heard of it. I remember that. People asking themselves, where's Pearl Harbor? They needed a geography lesson. My parents were not what you would call educated people. And in the sense that we refer to educated people. They worked hard, and they took care of their kids and so on. But as far as worldly affairs didn't mean anything as compared to the fact that they were rationing now during the war, and how are we going to get the food, and the day-to-day things of surviving. And so we went through the process of ration books and collecting foil, because we didn't smoke in our household. We had friends who smoked, and they had accumulation of big bags of foil, big balls of foil that were accumulated from tearing off the silver insides of the cigarette packages and so on. But and we also washed out the cans and opened up both ends of the tin cans and flattened them out and tied those together. And the Boy Scouts would come by and pick those up, plus newspapers that were tied up. And all that went for the war effort.
Now, did you ever know the fate of any of your family that was still in Europe during World War II?
No, actually not until the end of the war, or after the war had actually ended, did I, as a child, back then, my parents were, and I don't know if this was true of many people their age and their category of people who came over who were uneducated, but if you talked about, the idea was that if you talked about something bad, then bad things would happen. There was sort of that kind of feeling. You didn't mention the word cancer at all, because that might give you cancer. I mean, that was at that level. And they didn't take kids to funerals, because funerals were bad things. And, that would affect children's minds or something, I mean, there was that kind of attitude. Not just my parents, but other people around us were like that. We didn't find out till the end of the war about Auschwitz. My father thought Franklin Roosevelt was the greatest president of the United States because he got us out of the Depression. He helped to push for social programs, which Hoover did not. And that's what my father remembered. What he didn't know, and nobody's going to tell him either, that Roosevelt turned back that shipload of Jews who tried to come into the United States. But a lot of those things were sort of covered up and at the time that Roosevelt was alive. And the press sort of, they're not like the press of today. They had certain inhibitions or certain codes of conduct, not mentioning FDR's paralysis and never showing him with his crutches and his legs in braces and things like that. So those were things we learned about later,
Right.
including the horrors of Auschwitz.
Yeah.
We did have a cousin that we visited. We took a train up to Toronto. There was a young man who escaped and ended up coming to Canada and joining family there. And we did go for a visit then. That's the only thing I remember about family.
Where'd you go to high school?
I went to a number of different schools. And I eventually went back, but I started at Samuel Gompers Vocational High School. Then I went to Metropolitan Vocational High School. And one day I was working at a store, a camera store. I got interested in photography. I was in a camera store, a lunch break, walking the street, coming back from lunch to the store in the Bronx. And my brother, my oldest brother, Ruby, the cop, saw me on the street and said, "What are you doing out of school?" And I told him I dropped out. He had gotten married. He wasn't living at home. And my other brother was in Texas going to college after he came back from the military. So no one was home except myself and my mother. My parents had separated. And so I had dropped out of school and got a job and so on. And I told him that. He says, "Well, you have to have a high school diploma. You just can't. Nowadays, it's a college diploma you have to have. And back then, you had to have at least a high school diploma to get anywhere." And so he talked me into going back. And by that time, my age at that time, I don't recall exactly, but under the law of New York State, New York City, I should say, the principal of the school didn't have to take you back if you were above a certain age. And so the first school that he took me back was an academic school and high school, and they wouldn't take me back, wouldn't take me. Then he took me to his school that he graduated from, which was then called a commercial school, Theodore Roosevelt High School, for people who worked at offices and whatever. And but he showed up with me in his uniform, and I think that impressed the principal, that he's bringing back a kid who isn't in trouble in the normal sense,
Right.
One of the students, but he's vouching for this kid, his brother. And so they took me back, and I finished, fairly quickly within a year and graduated.
So after high school, was it to college, to work, or did you go into the
We didn't have money for college.
Right.
College was out. And I didn't have any kind of grades or whatever that would qualify for scholarships. And scholarships were not that well publicized or known back then as they are today. And so I had dropped out of school and I was going to work. And so of course, work could be an education too. I went to an employment agency, and now that I had a high school diploma, I wanted a better job. And so I went to an employment agency, and they sent me to an office. I didn't know where I was going, actually. I just went to an address, 50 Rockefeller Plaza. And it turned out to be the Associated Press. building. And it was the news features department of Associated Press. And they needed a gopher, an office boy to deliver things. They used to have inboxes and outboxes on every desk. That was before email and before computers. And so they needed people to come around and take the things out of the outbox and put things in the inbox so people could get their communications within the company. Well, the AP News Features was one big open room. This is before they had cubicles. And in this big open room, you had the editor over here. You had a separate room over here. You had the women's writers plus the sports writer in here. You had the proofreader over here who would proofread all the articles. And you had sports people, you had the theater writer, and a lot of these writers would not be there all the time. They would do a lot of their work at home or whatever, and then show up and come in and turn their work in, talk to the editor. You had the theater, you had the scientific writer, Blakesley was his name. You had Saul Pett. These were people that you may never have heard of, but back then they were, prize-winning people, writers. And then you had all these layout people, cartoonists, and artists with their air sprays to make these illustrations and so on that would go into news features. That is, they would take the main articles and so on. These are not top news. That was another floor. But this was features. And they had subscribers. And this was an education for me. One of my jobs, other than just in and out box, was to gather up on Wednesday. There was a desk downstairs on the 4th floor. And all the newspapers that were AP members, all the Sunday papers, were thrown on this desk, or 4 or 5 desks that were pushed together. And my job was to take a list that was given by the editor and pick out the Sunday papers of the various newspapers that they selected. And if there were any articles in those papers that were articles that came from news features, they would be torn out and be used to publicize the news features to get more subscribers. So in the process, I learned all the major newspapers by heart across the United States. Right. So you had the Tulsa World, you had the Chicago Tribune, you had the New York City Tribune, you had the Seattle Times, you had the New Orleans Intelligentsia, you had all kinds. I mean, I remember all that from going through that. So it was an education. I got interested in photography, and so I was able to communicate with the camera photography writer or editor who had a column on photography. His name was Doc Desfor. And so I got interested in photography. I even developed and printed my own negatives in the bathroom at home by buying this little kit and so on. And one day I came to the camera editor with this roll of film. I said, "What happened to this film of mine? You know, it has these were pictures I took at Rockefeller Plaza at the center, the ice skating rink, where you have ice skaters down below and you take pictures from above. And this showed a lady, an instructor or a mother, with a girl who had the fancy puffy dress and her ice skates and so on with the, what do you call these, muffs or something that they put her hands in to keep warm, and skating around and giving instruction. And he said, "Can I use this picture in my column?" I said, "Why? It's got all those marks." And he said, "That's it. It's called reticulation." I said, "What?" He says, reticulation, I'm going to write a column about reticulation and use your picture in it. And reticulation happens when in the process of the development, if your water is too hot, it'll break up the emulsion. It'll melt the emulsion. And it has this configuration that develops as a result where the film breaks apart in different spots. And so you can see the picture and what it was supposed to be, but it has an artistic effect to it. So it wasn't planned, but anyway, so I was hooked, on photography.
Right. That's how you got into it. When did the service come into play?
And I tried to join the Army because I needed formal schooling, and I couldn't afford it. I was told that by the recruiting sergeant that you can pick your school, you can pick your job. Photography school? Yep. And the photography school for the U.S. Army was across the river in New Jersey at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. They had radar, they had the electronics and so on, but they also had photography. So I tried to join the Army. At first they wouldn't take me in 1950 after I turned 17. I don't know if because I had dropped out of school or they said it was because of my eyes. My eyes was that I was technically and legally blind without glasses. I used to have thick glasses before cataract surgery years later. And they everything was blurry without glasses. And they wouldn't take me. But 6 months later, the Korean War occurred, and I got a little postcard in the mail saying that we'll reconsider you. And I didn't want to go to war. But anyway, but what happened was when they turned me down, I joined the New York National Guard. And I was in the New York National Guard for 3 years and 9 months. It's supposed to be 3 years, but when the Korean War began, I was already in the National Guard. And they froze enlistments. They wouldn't allow people out because they may need to send the National Guard overseas to Korea, which they did, but not ours. In 1954, after getting out of photography school, I went from the National Guard to the Army Reserve unit after I got out of there, because in the National Guard, I was in a warehouse and so on, and I didn't like that kind of thing. But if I joined this Army Reserve unit, there was a place for a photographer. And I joined it, and then the major in charge said, you know some things, but you really need to go to that school. Now, if you're not really tied down, can you spend 4 months temporarily in the Army in New Jersey? I said, sure. So I went to school for 4 months under that program and went through photography school in the Army, and I did very well. They had contests every week, and the top 3 guys in the school, in that class, could leave early on a Friday, where everyone else had to march around and so on before they could get their weekend pass. And so the 3 of us, one fellow who used to be a newspaper photographer, myself and someone else, were usually the ones that were always in the top of the week. We would compete during the week for different things, different job assignments. So in any case, I enjoyed that experience, and I learned a lot. You learn the basics and so on.
Was there ever a fear of going to Korea, or Korea was already over at that time?
Korea was, 50. Yeah, Korea was over.
Okay. But it was still the Korean War era.
Yeah, and Korea was still in ruins.
Yeah.
And in fact, after I came out of the Army, came out of that school, that 4-month program, and tried to get a job in photography in New York, which was ridiculous because there were so many people with so many years of actual experience in photography, let alone someone just out of school, who couldn't find work because it was so competitive, and still is competitive in New York. And so I decided I needed some firsthand experience. And so I joined the Army. I enlisted and went through basic training, which was quite a an experience. But anyway, by that time I was a sergeant. See, I'd been earned the rank of corporal in the National Guard, then Army Reserve. I became a sergeant. And so I actually went into the Army when I enlisted as a sergeant. Well, they said they could take those stripes away from you in basic training if you didn't earn them. If you didn't hold up to that level category of command. And so it was the night before that I was to be sent down to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, because my name began with a K, and everyone A through J stayed in Fort Dix, and everyone from K to Z was sent down to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, because they didn't have enough room. That night, the night before I was due to leave for Fort Leonard Wood, I was in the barracks in my room with another sergeant. He was going for discharge. He was a master sergeant and had over 30 years experience in the military. He was going out. But he saw me beginning to sew my stripes on. He says, "What are you doing?" He knew my situation. I said, "Well, I'm a sergeant. I'm sewing my stripes." He said, "Don't do it." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Don't do it until they tell you to do it." And that saved my life, because I got down there in Missouri, and there were other guys with corporal stripes and sergeant stripes from the National Guard and from the Army Reserve and so on, much like myself, who came in with a rank. And they would just chase those guys around and make them do push-ups. And what are you wearing those stripes for? So on and so forth. Then they called my name out. I took my step forward. They were taking a roll. And he looked at he was ready to yell at me, but he saw there were no stripes. I disappointed him. And he says, "How come you're not wearing your stripes, Kasten?" And I said, "Well, waiting for orders, Sergeant." He says, "Good. Step back." Anyway, I lucked out. And there was another story during basic training where I had been writing to a friend from the Bronx who was in the Air Force, and he was stationed in Florida, and I was writing back and forth about my experiences in basic training. And I mentioned that the following week I was going to be in bayonet drill. So he said when they were in basic training and bayonet drill, they charged forward with the bayonet, and they yelled, "Kill! Kill!" And so I was waiting for that, and then when it came to our training, the guy said, "Go, hoot, hoot." And so I waited, and I didn't know if I was going to be in trouble or not. But when the cadre, the assistant, came around behind us as we were doing these lunges, instead of going along with everyone else going, "Hoo, hoo," I went, "Kill, kill," mimicking my friend's suggestion. And I knew he paused behind me, and then later when we were taking a rest, he said, where did you learn that? And he says, "I thought it would be the thing to do. That's what you're trying to do with someone with a bayonet, is kill them. So you lunge forward and you'll kill." So then I saw him walk up to the leader up on the stand who was leading the hundreds of guys with these lunges. And after the break, the guy up front said, "I want everybody to forget about who and start saying kill." That story did not end, because word got around, and all around Fort Leonard Wood, which was basic training in all these different units, they began changing it from hook to kill. It just, like an epidemic, the word got around.
See what you started? Where did you meet your wife?
At the University of Texas. I had come down to Texas now that I had the Korean GI Bill, and I'd seen I'd never been out of New York City, basically, and my parents didn't travel. I mean, if we took a little break or something, it was to Coney Island or rent a bungalow or something like that. And so my brother, one of my brothers, Fred, he had been in Texas. He married a Texas girl. Yeah, she's from El Paso. And we met at the University of Texas. I did my freshman year at University of Houston, which was a private school at that time and much smaller than it is now. I got interested in history. And I came down to Houston. My brother had been there. Of course, at the time, I didn't think that, but in the years since, I realized why I came to Texas. Because if my brother could be successful at school in Texas, then so could I. So anyway, I think that was really it. University of Houston had a program in photography at the time, but I got interested in history. Maybe I was a history professor or whatever, and I took all the history classes they had at the time, and I decided after a year and a half at the University of Houston that I should transfer to the University of Texas. They had a bigger program, more classes and bigger school. And I transferred to the University of Texas, and that's where I met my wife at the Hillel, the Jewish Hillel.
Well, let me ask you, you said you were heavy as a child. I see the picture of you in the Army, skinny.
Well, not skinny, but relatively skinny.
Okay.
I was 180.
Okay.
So I lost almost 100 pounds.
How'd you lose the weight?
Well, the New York City school system, my attitude towards school was I'd rather go to the baseball game. They came up with a program. I was listed as a obese person with the nurses. The nurses had all the underweight and overweight people on their list. The city of New York at that time opened up a nutrition clinic, and they invited, through the school system, any children who were overweight or underweight to come to the nutrition clinic to help them straighten out and get healthy. So when I called into the nurse, I was told that if I went to this, it would be on a Friday, okay, and all I had to do was show up at school in the morning, then I could go to the nutrition clinic and I wouldn't have to go to classes on Friday.
Deal.
So that was a deal. I'd give it a try.
Yeah.
And I went to the nutrition clinic, and they had all kinds of plastic food. The nutritionist showed you, is this what you're talking about, what kind of food you were eating? They had all kinds of samples and so on, and of specimen type of food. And they wanted to find out, what you're used to eating, and asked all kinds of questions. And of course, I ate a lot of candy, a lot of snacks, a lot of bread, a lot of schmaltz. You know what schmaltz is?
Of course.
All right, chicken fat, melted chicken fat. I used to smear the bread because that's what my parents did. And their belief, the European belief, is if you're fat, you're healthy. Because they're remembering the shtetl, where if you were starving, you were thin.
Right.
So in any case, that's what I was used to eating. Candy and lots of bread and schmaltz and fried food and so on. And so in any case, then the nutritionist sent me to the doctor. The doctor was next door in the same clinic, and they examined you and so on. They took blood tests and whatever. All this was free. And so what they came out with in their analysis was this: stop eating all that bread, stop with the schmaltz, stop the fried food, stop the candy. Okay? And because of an iron deficiency, I was to eat liver. Okay? And that was it. And they said, doing this, you should lose about 2 pounds a week. I tried it. Next week I showed up, got on their scale, I had lost 2 pounds. The following week I came back, I lost another 2 pounds. And not only that, plus the fact that every time I came back and lost some weight, they would applaud. They were a cheering section.
Right.
And people at home in the Bronx, Jerry, how did you lose so much weight? What is your secret? What's your diet? And that made me feel good because I was getting reinforcement, positive reinforcement that I was losing weight, so I kept it up.
So you met Deanna at school, and when did you guys get married?
We both graduated in 1960. Okay. She went on to go back to El Paso to teach. Now, I graduated, but I only decided to be a teacher in my last semester, so I had to come back to the University of Texas to take courses in education in order to earn credits for a teaching certificate. I was living at a co-op at the University of Texas, and one of the fellows there said, "What are you going to do this summer?" I said, "Well, I'm coming back to school, but I'd like to find some work and earn some money." And he was the son of a French diplomat. And he was very familiar with what the ins and outs of Washington, D.C., because his father had been an ambassador there, was the ambassador. And he was going to school here on the track team and so on. Anyway, so he said, "Why don't you get a job as either a park ranger or a forest ranger?" I said, "For the summer?" First of all, I'd never been to a national park or a national forest. Like I said, New York City is all I knew. And so, yeah, he says, "You write to the Department of Agriculture for the Forest Service and ask for some employment form, and do the same thing with the Department of the Interior for the Park Service, for a park ranger, and they'll send you forms and a list of parks." And I did. And this was around Christmas time, Christmas break. And I filled out all these forms, and I picked out places and so on, and I mailed them to them. Back then, you could mail as many as you wanted to. Now you're limited, and it's all electronic, online employment. But in any case, came back 2 positive replies. One from the Forest Service for a forest ranger in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where I had read about and knew about of having a reputation for the biggest trout in the United States. And I love to fish, or thought of fishing. And the other one came back from the Park Service for a park ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park just outside of Estes Park, Colorado, which was fairly closer. And so I had 2 positive replies. I could only say yes to one of them. So what I did is I took photographs that I got from National Geographic, I think, of what a forest ranger looks like, a uniform, and a park ranger, and another picture. And I was dating a girl, not the one that I married, but some other girl that I'd gone with a few dates on, to her sorority house. And she was there in the lobby with these other girls sitting around. And I said, "Girls, take a look at these 2 uniforms. Which do you like the best?" And most of them liked the park ranger uniform. This hat right here. And I said, "Okay." And so I sent back my form to the Rocky Mountain National Park, and that's where I became a park ranger. That was the beginning of my career as a park ranger during the summers, when I taught the rest of the year. And I did that in 1960, 61, 62, 1960 at Rocky Mountain National Park, 1961, 2, and 3 in Yellowstone National Park, and again in 1967, because we had children in between, and again in 1971, with the kids to Mammoth Cave, Kentucky, to Cave City, Kentucky, and spent the summer there. And so I was a park ranger all those years, or those summers. And so in any case, I ended up having a date, going back to my wife, at the park, and we began to write to each other. Well, she came to El Paso. In 60, I went up to Rocky Mountain National Park, and a band ranger. Then I applied to Yellowstone in 61. Meanwhile, we had been writing. She was doing graduate work now in Ohio State for a master's. And I said, "Look, I've got this job coming up in this summer, in summer of 61, in Yellowstone. And a friend of mine, or someone that I know there, runs the concessions. And I'm pretty sure if I asked him, he could give you a job for the summer along with these other college kids and so on." That was in 63 that she not 61, 63, that she came to Yellowstone from Ohio State Graduate School and to work in Yellowstone for the summer. Because I said, look, I'm tired of writing. Let's get back together and see if we want to make this a permanent thing, And we got engaged that summer. And it was on the top of the Ferris wheel at the Idaho State Fair in Boise, Idaho, outside the park.
Where did you guys settle down when you got married?
Well, she's from El Paso, and she went back to El Paso after we got engaged. I began teaching in 61 in Dallas, so I had a teaching job here. And so she came to Dallas, and we were married in El Paso in 1 month after the Kennedy assassination, December 22nd, 1963, in El Paso, Texas, and moved to Dallas.
And did you both go into teaching then for your careers?
She did at first, and got into a situation where it was very difficult to find a teaching position at that time, and for a new teacher, and in the area, and she accepted a job as a special ed teacher. She actually was trained in English as an English teacher. So she accepted a job as a special ed teacher in R.L. Turner High School and got interested in psychology and began working on a master's in psychology, which she earned from TWU part-time, and became a counselor, a marriage and family counselor. And that's what she did for the rest of life, and that's what she's still doing. She has an office and a private business.
And you stayed a teacher?
And I stayed a teacher and retired in 1990. I still teach as a substitute teacher in Plano Senior High School and Plano West Senior High School primarily.
That's great. What was the happiest time in your life?
Oh, being with my wife, traveling, going on the road and so on with her in the national parks.
Was there an invention in your lifetime that came along that you said, wow, how did we ever get along without that?
I guess maybe GPS, traveling. I don't have to get those maps out,
right.
And so on.
Now, in your lifetime, you've lived through so many momentous occasions, of course, the Korean War era, Vietnam era, turbulent times, in the 60s, right when you were graduating, President Kennedy assassination, the moon landing, something good in 69, of course, Martin Luther King assassination, tragedy of 9/11. Was there something that came along that you go, I know exactly where I was and what I was doing when it happened?
But the events that really stand out in my mind are ones where I actually met people, where I actually face-to-face, and some of them were difficult meetings, but people who were well-known to most people, like LBJ, my meeting with LBJ, my meeting with Sam Rayburn.
Why did you meet Sam Rayburn and LBJ?
Well, I was a student at the University of Texas. I put forth an idea to the student radio station, KUTFM. I said, you don't have a public affairs program. You play music, all kinds of music, and so on. You have sports and so on, but you don't have public affairs. And that's what I was interested in, in public affairs, what's going on in the world, current events, government, and so on. And that was before CNN. And so the director, Winston Bodie, said, well, what's your idea? And I set forth an idea that I would produce and direct once a week for a half hour, that it would go over the air for a half hour. It would be taped and different things that would have a theme song in the beginning and so on. And I produced a program, I can't even think of the name of it, but I produced a program that for them. And in the process, I would interview people. Austin was always a busy place. It's the capital. It's a big university. Very interesting people come through, political and historical and scientific and whatever. And so there was never a problem of finding people to interview on worthwhile subjects like tektites and things, different scientific things and so on. General Aramburu was coming to town for some reason. General Aramburu of Argentina. He later became president of Argentina and later was assassinated. And I met him here in Austin at a hotel and interviewed him. It was all on wire recording, the old tape recordings and so on.
And when you interviewed LBJ, what was he at the time?
Well, what happened was I had read in the paper, here I was a student, and my courses were paid for by the government, but I worked part-time, different jobs in photography and so on, and I needed money. And so I'd read about LBJ's famous picnics that he would hold on the LBJ Ranch, and barbecues and so on. And I read that the president of Mexico, Adolfo López Mateos, who had been visiting President Eisenhower and heading back to Mexico, was going to be the guest of LBJ on his ranch. And the press was invited. So I said to Mr. Bodie, Mr. Bodie, aren't I a member of the press? Producer, he said, yeah. And he says, well, can you get me, go down to the Senator, there's a majority leader, Senator Lyndon Johnson was the majority leader, the Senate majority leader. He's got an Austin office. Can you get the credentials for me? So he got credentials for me, and I got a friend of mine who spoke from where I lived, who spoke English, translated. He was going to be my translator, spoke Spanish and so on. And I was going to ask questions of the president of Mexico and other people from his entourage about a new agreement between the two universities, Mexico City University and University of Texas, for exchanging students. And I had a list of different possibilities to talk about and interview people and put together a program out of these different interviews. And so they gave me this big tape, this big recorder, big heavy magnecorder, whatever it was called, with a microphone with a wooden stick to it, attached to it, and a big cable. And so we went down with my credentials on the LBJ ranch and waited until people were eating dessert. Everybody else was standing around, but the dignitaries could sit at tables outside and barbecue. So we stuffed ourselves with food. I promised my friend he could have food too, and that's why we went to begin with, to get food, free food. And there's LBJ sitting with President Adolfo López Mateos. And I waited for dessert, which was the end of the meal. And I said to my friend, I said, let the tape run. Okay, you listen on your headset, let the tape run. And I had a real long cable for the mic cord, and because that's what it was for. And I walked out with the mic cord wound around my arm and came up and waited until they were talking back and forth and they were finished with their food. I said, excuse me, Mr. President, could I ask you a question? And LBJ stood half up in his seat and said, he pushed the microphone out, and he said, get that thing away from the president. This is not a what do you call it, a press conference. A press conference. This is not a press conference. And the President Mateos had already indicated, like, yes, I'll answer your question. But then after LBJ yelled at me, Mateos began to laugh, and he said, what could I do? In other words, it's his place. And so I said, okay, thank you. And then I walked away. All this is on tape.
Right.
Then I walked away, and there was a sign in front of somebody that said, Education Minister from Mexico. And I asked him the same question about this exchange program and whatever. Then I saw, down at the end, Sam Rayburn. Now, this was the summer of the election, the primary election for the Democratic Party for President of the United States, the 1960 election. And Sam Rayburn came out in favor of LBJ as opposed to JFK. Oh, by the way, Harry Truman was there too, but I never got to talk to him. anyway, so I knew from my government class at the University of Texas about Sam Rayburn. He was so proud of the fact that he was reelected so many times, means once every 4 years, or 2 years, whatever it was, as opposed to a senator who gets reelected every 6 years, who doesn't have to be reelected that often to stay in office. So he had a reputation as being proud of the fact that he was the people's representative from his district. And so, any case, I remembered that. I was thinking about what should I call him. I was going to ask him a question about the election. And I walked over, the tape is going, I got the mic under my arm, I have a clipboard, which more or less hides the microphone. And I walk over, and he and Sam Rayburn are talking. And, he and the head of the Department of Public Safety. And he looked like Kojak, bald head. He always had a cigar in his mouth and so on. He looked tough, Sam Rayburn. And so I walked over, and I wanted to interrupt the conversation. And I wanted to say, Mr. Rayburn, or, Congressman Rayburn. And I said, Senator Rayburn. I realized I said the wrong thing. And he looked up and said, who the hell do you think you're calling senator? And I wanted him to stop, to realize we're being taped. And so I took my clipboard away, and I showed him the mic, and I said, we're on the air, which is wrong. And he said, get that damn thing away from me, just like LBJ done, and pushed the microphone away.
So you got a meal, though.
Pardon me?
But you got a meal.
Oh, I got the meal, and he finally answered my question. I felt like walking away and not saying anything, but what do you want to know? And I asked him about the chances of LBJ winning and so on, and then I walked away.
Jerry, you and Deanna married 52 years now.
Yeah.
Have twin girls and a son and a total of 5 grandkids. What advice does Granddad have for the next generation?
Don't be afraid to try something new.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to try something different, because of my own experience. Of course, a lot of these kids, they're programmed, you're going to go to college, you're going to go here, you're going to go where I went, and so on. And so, don't be afraid to test the waters, to try things new, different.
Thanks for doing this today.
Oh, I enjoyed it.